The first planes of the mass onslaught came over a little before 10 a.m. They were the fighters and dive bombers. The main road running crosswise in front of us was their bomb line. They were to bomb only on the far side of that road. Our infantry had been pulled back a few hundred yards from the near side of the road. Everyone in the area had been given the strictest orders to be in foxholes, for high-level bombers can, and do quite excusably, make mistakes. So did you understand that right there? Mm-hmm. So there's a very clear road, and they say, listen, the bombers are going to be bombing the other side of that road, but we're going to back further away from the road just in case something goes wrong, just in case bombs get dropped early. Obviously, this indicates I'm pointing that out for a reason, because gets horrible. Our front lines were marked by long strips of colored cloth laid on the ground, with colored smoke to guide our airmen during the mass bombing. Dive bombers hit it just right. We stood and watched them barrel nearly straight down out of the sky. They were bombing about a half a mile ahead of where we stood. They came in groups, diving in every direction. Perfectly timed, one after another. Everywhere we looked, separate groups of planes were on their way down or on their way back up, or slanting over for a dive, or circling over our heads and waiting for their turn. So I want you to picture what this is like. Picture what this is like. And you don't picture that you're watching it in a movie, because I understand that it's easy to picture it, okay? Yeah. I want you to put your mind in this situation. Can you imagine what that looks like? The sky is basically filling with planes, and they're making these incredibly aggressive attacks. And this piece, which I'm about to read a big chunk, this is one of the most magnificent descriptions of war I have read. Here we go. The air was full of sharp and distinct sounds of cracking bombs and the heavy rips of the plane's machine guns and the splintering screams of diving wings. It was all fast and furious, yet distinct. And then a new sound gradually droned into our ears. A deep sound and all-encompassing with no notes in it. Just a gigantic faraway surge of doom-like sound. It was the heavies. And so now he's talking about the heavy bombers that are going to bring the thunder. And there's so many of them, and they're so loud it just drones out every other sound until just this massive faraway surge of a doom-like sound. It was the heavies. They came from directly behind us. At first, they were the merest dots in the sky. We could see the clots of them against the far heavens. Too tiny to count individually, they came on with a terrible slowness. They came in flights of 12, 3 flights to a group, and in groups stretched out across the sky. They came in families of about 70 planes each. Maybe those gigantic waves were 2 miles apart. Maybe they were 10 miles. I don't know. But I do know they came in constant procession, and I thought it would never end. What the Germans must have thought is beyond comprehension. The flight across the sky was slow and studied. I've never known a storm or a machine or any resolve of man that had about it the aura of such a ghastly relentlessness. I had the feeling that even had God appeared beseechingly before them in the sky with palms outstretched to persuade them back, they would not have had the power within them to turn from their irresistible course. This is just, that's such an incredible description of this impending doom. I stood with a little group of men, ranging from colonels to privates, back to the stone farmhouse. Slit trenches were all around the edges of the farmyard, and a dugout with a tin roof was nearby. But we were so fascinated by the spectacle overhead that it never occurred to us that we might need the foxholes. The first huge flight passed directly overhead, and others followed. We spread our feet and leaned far back, trying to look straight up until our steel helmets fell off. We'd cup our fingers around our eyes like field glasses for a clearer view. And then the bombs came. They began like the crackle of popcorn and almost instantly swelled into a monstrous fury of noise that seemed surely to destroy all the world ahead of us. From then on, for an hour and a half that had in it the agonies of centuries, the bombs came down. A wall of smoke and dust erected by them grew high in the sky. It filtered along the ground, back through our orchards. It sifted around us and into our noses. The bright day grew slowly dark from it. By now, everything was an indescribable cauldron of sounds. Individual noises did not exist. The thundering of the motors in the sky and the roar of bombs ahead filled all the space for noise on the earth. Our own heavy artillery was crashing all around us, yet we could hardly hear it. The Germans began to shoot heavy, high ack-ack. Great puffs of it by the score speckled the sky until it was hard to distinguish smoke puffs from planes. And then someone shouted that one of the planes was smoking. Yes, we could all see it. A faint line of black smoke stretched straight for a mile behind one of them. And as we watched, there were a gigantic sweep of flame over the plane. From nose to tail, it disappeared in flame, and it slanted slowly down and banked around the sky in great wide curves this way and that, as rhythmically and gracefully as in a slow motion waltz. Then suddenly it seemed to change its mind and swept upward steeper and steeper and ever slower until finally it seemed poised motionless on its own black pillar of smoke. And then, just as slowly as it had turned over and dived for the earth, a golden spearhead on the straight black shaft of its own creation, and disappeared behind the treetops. But before it was down, there were more cries of, "There's another one smoking, and there's a third one now." Shoots came out of some of the planes. Out of some came no shoots at all. One of the white silk caught on the tail of a plane. Men with binoculars could see him fighting to get loose until flames swept over him, and then a tiny black dot fell through space, all alone. And all that time, the great flat ceiling of the sky was roofed by other planes that didn't go down, plowing their way forward as if there were no turmoil in the world. Nothing deviated them by the slightest. They stalked on, slowly and with a dreadful pall of sound, as though they were seeing only something at a great distance and nothing existed between. God, how we admired those men up there and sickened for the ones who fell. Incredible. It is possible to become so enthralled by some of the spectacles of war that man is momentarily captivated away from his own danger. That's what happened to our little group of soldiers as we stood watching the mighty bombing. But that benign state didn't last long. As we watched, there crept into our consciousness a realization that the windrows of exploding bombs were easing back towards us, flight by flight, instead of gradually forward, as the plan called for. Then we were horrified by the suspicion that those machines high in the sky and completely detached from us were aiming their bombs at the smoke line on the ground, and a gentle breeze was drifting the smoke line back over us. An indescribable kind of panic came over us. We stood tensed in muscle and frozen in intellect, watching each flight approach and pass over, feeling trapped and completely helpless. And then, all of an instant, the universe became filled with gigantic rattling of huge ripe seeds in a mammoth dry gourd. I doubt that any of us had ever heard that sound before, but instinct told us what it was. It was bombs by the hundred hurtling down through the air above us. Many times I'd heard bombs whistle or swish or rustle, but never before had I heard bombs rattle. I still don't know what the explanation of it, but it was an awful sound. We dived. Some got into a dugout, others made foxholes and ditches, and some got behind a garden wall, although which side would be behind was anybody's guess. I was too late for the dugout. The nearest place was a wagon shed which formed on one end of the stone house. The rattle was right down upon us. I remember hitting the ground flat, all spread out like the cartoons of people flattened by steamrollers, and then squirming like an eel to get under one of the heavy wagons in the shed. An officer whom I didn't know was wriggling beside me. We stopped at the same time, simultaneously feeling it was hopeless to move further. The bombs were already crashing around us. We lay with our heads slightly up like two snakes staring at each other. I know it was in both our minds and in our eyes, asking each other what to do. Neither of us knew. We said nothing. We just lay, sprawled, gaping at each other in a futile appeal, our faces about a foot apart, until it was over. There is no description of the sound and fury of those bombs except to say it was chaos and a waiting for darkness. The feeling of the blast was sensational. The air struck us in hundreds of continuing flutters. Our ears drummed and rang. We could feel quick little waves of concussion on our chest and in our eyes. At last the sound died down, and we looked at each other in disbelief. Gradually, we left the foxholes and sprawling places and came out to see what the sky had in store for us. As far as we could see, other waves were approaching from behind. When a wave would pass a little to the side of us, we were grateful, for most of them flew directly overhead. Time and time again, the rattle came down over us. Bombs struck in the orchard to our left. They struck into the orchards ahead of us. They struck as far as a mile behind us. Everything about us was shaken, but our group came through unhurt. I can't record what any of us actually felt or thought during those horrible climaxes. I believe a person's feelings at such time are kaleidoscopic and indefinable. He just waits. That's all, with an inhuman tenseness of muscle and nerves. An hour or so later, I began to get sore all over, and by mid-afternoon, my back and shoulders ached as though I'd been beaten with a club. It was simply the result of muscles tensing themselves too tight for too long against anticipated shock. When we came out of our sprawling and stood up again to watch, we knew that the error had been caught and checked. The bombs were falling again where they were intended, a mile or so ahead. Even at a mile away, 1,000 bombs hitting within a few seconds can shake the earth and shatter the air. There was still a dread in our hearts, but it gradually eased as the tumult and destruction moved slightly forward. It seems incredible to me that any German could have come out of that bombardment with his sanity. When it was over, even I was grateful in a chastened way that I had never experienced before for just being alive. I thought an attack by our troops was impossible then, for it is an unnerving thing to be bombed by your own planes. During the bad part, a colonel I had known a long time was walking up and down behind the farmhouse, snapping his fingers and saying over and over again to himself, "God damn it! God damn it!" As he passed me once, he stopped and stared and said, "God damn it!" And I said, there can't be any attack now, can there? And he said no, and began walking again, snapping his fingers and tossing his arms as though he were throwing rocks at the ground. The leading company of our battalion was to spearhead the attack 40 minutes after the heavy bombing ceased. The company had been hit directly by our bombs. Their casualties, including casualties in shock, were heavy. Men went to pieces and had to be sent back. The company was shattered and shaken. Yet Company B attacked, and on time to the minute. They attacked and within the hour sent back word that they advanced 800 yards through German territory and were still going. Around our farmyard, men with stars on their shoulders almost wept when the word came over the portable radio. The American soldier can be majestic when he needs to be. I'm sure that back in England that night, other men, bomber crews, wept. And maybe they did really in the awful knowledge that they had killed our own American troops. But the chaos and bitterness there in the orchards and between the hedgerows that afternoon soon passed. After the bitterness came the sober remembrance that the Air Force was the strong right arm in front of us, not only at the beginning, but ceaselessly and everlastingly. Every moment of the faintest daylight, the Air Force was up there banging away ahead of us. Anybody made mistakes. The enemy made them just the same as we did. The smoke and confusion of battle bewildered us on the ground as well in the air. And in this case, the percentage of error was really very small compared to the colossal storm of bombs that fell upon the enemy. The Air Force was wonderful throughout the invasion, and the men on the ground appreciated it. So, obviously we talk about blue on blue a lot here. I think that's about as an extreme example as I've ever heard of. Mm-hmm. And, the blue on blue thing is such a nightmare because it's your own people. It's your own people. And it's a lack of communication, and it's the fog of war. And you can't do anything. You can't shoot back. Mm-hmm. All you can do is sit there and wait. And it's amazing. One of those company that was scheduled to attack is so shaken up that they can't go forward. But then the other company just go, we got this. Step aside.